Hello everyone, today we talk about Bulgars, Khazars and Magyars for our Eurasian Steppes Warfare series. We have arrived to the early Middle Ages, going through all the various waves of nomadic peoples that crushed against Central, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even beyond at a point, looking at how especially arms and armor modified themselves according to the political and strategic needs of these peoples. We have seen the complexities in the historical reconstruction of their quite complex ethnogenesis. We have looked at these bigger eras, right? The one of essentially Indo-European dominance of the steppes that began from the domestication of horse and its eventual use militarily wise, and the Turkic one started in what we call at least the migration era, late antiquity, early Middle Ages, mostly embodied by the Huns and later by the Göktürks. A wave that had been caused by the collapse of the previous Iranian order, and that had triggered significant political and social changes in Eurasia that are not different in trend from the ones of the sedentary civilizations, fundamentally the impoverishment of the average freeman, the creation of more powerful oligarchies. And however, the contraction and fragmentation of the also the ethnic space, as you understand, especially in the steppes, right? In the steppes, we are mostly habituated to spot the cause, right, of the destruction. The idea of these peoples arrived, and so that in the sedentary world we had it worse for some reason. But telling the truth, they were having it much worse themselves, especially in outcome. Right, and these peoples mostly had a much more complicated, much more difficult government than before. The political stability decreased dramatically on a systemic way, and even very large empires, universal ones, such as for example, the Göktürk Khaganate, underwent a cycle, basically, of perennial destruction and rejuvenation that, on the longer run, didn't favor, however, the settlement of a larger, powerful steppe empire, right? But if anything, the fragmentation of the same, with another trend that we have observed in the essential civilization of many nomadic peoples, right? Especially closer, obviously, so by the way, to the sedentary civilizations, a process that has started since the very beginning. We have observed how even the most advanced steppes panoplies were basically, even though original in synthesis and in the contribution of the local traditions, essentially built up through basically sedentary technology, different tools, elements that were essentially brought together for the, again, political and military needs of the nomadic peoples, right? The importance of controlling the Silk Road and roads at a point, the melange that had occurred with also already certain sedentarized peoples once nomadic themselves, that left a massive cultural influence, right? This is the case of the Indo-Aryans with the Turks later on. And so again, also an overall blend. Many areas of influence from different civilizations were undergoing comparable, but also, of course, different processes. So today we'll look at the peoples of the steppes, but also the ones of the foothills, we could call them that way, in observing the areas of greater meeting, say, with the sedentary world and the development accordingly, right? After the Hunnic invasion and the migration of the Avars that we've looked at in the prior video, in which we already highlighted essentially the importance, for example, of the sedentary subjects, right, for the fortune of the Avar Khaganate, right, that however also was absorbed, not even so much on the longer run, right, but a couple of centuries by the same sedentary world. The connections that these peoples had maintained already from the extremities, the longitudinal extremities of the steppes, right? Think about the Sino-Avar trebuchet, right? As we'll see now, also the Persian influence in Magyar siege warfare and many other aspects, right? The Avars had been quite momentous in boosting further, at least from a technological point of view, the development of the early medieval European heavy cavalry. In many ways, they brought the stirrups, they brought heavier forms of armor. These weren't the causes of that, right? The only reason why these types of troops would develop were political and social inherently, right? But this shows also how much more connected than we think these populations really were. We will see it better perhaps in the next chapter, in which we will observe the Vikings as well, right? I have this habit now of usually inserting, not today, telling the truth, except perhaps for the Arabs a bit, the Caliphate, some sedentary protagonist for each episode. In any case, what you've seen with the Huns, with the Avars, is really a tidal wave, right, that hits pretty hard Central and Eastern Europe, and that had been the most impacting Turkic wave that had invested, again, these areas, together with, again, the relics of many other peoples that had been crushed and subjugated along the way, right, next to the ones that had been instead just been massacred on the spot. So when we look after this, right, in a moment of coldening, generally speaking, because the crisis had been quite manifest and lots of resources have been burned, both morally and materially, all this area, like of the western Eurasian steppes, right, and also towards the Kuban, right, looking also at the Don River, the foothills of Dagestan, the Volga area, the Caspian Sea, right, these were all inhabited now by the remnants of both the Turkic lords, much of which had actually just been crushed by the bigger wave, right? So that we're not faring tremendously well, right? For example, the remnants of the Hunnic Empire that, where another had been crushed first, say, halted by the Romans, then fundamentally lost its impetus and was, cannibalized by the same subject, mostly the Germans, other peoples from within had been scattered, becoming mercenary, settling here and there. And again, who are the Huns? Who are the Bulgars? Right? Because these are not simple, but fundamentally we do not know, in the sense that we do not really know what lays behind, even just the ethnonym behind the ethnogenesis. We know something, of course. We have some directions, certain coordinates, whatever, but say most of what happened in the steppes there is mostly what we say, okay, so these are the people that we know eventually settled there, so it's them, right? And in the steppes was like, no, it wasn't like you would see in a sedentary reality where you establish a political and territorial rule that fundamentally is substantiated also by that kind of base, and by, of course, the peoples they inhabited. There's a completely different mechanism. Of course, there are things in common. There are subjects also in the steppes. There are actually sedentaries in the steppes too at times. The problem being that these political struggles were mostly guided on the base of local kind of success, of moral force displayed essentially for the ability of this or that leader that managed to succeed and found another dynasty, and or being recognized with a, with attributing the clan a certain level of sacrality based on victory, and then other coalitions would form, and then they would split, and from these groups others would move away. So of course there were certain cores of peoples that were acting for this very reason, right, with a very sound political identity and strategic logic, so that we can identify them at some point. But the speed with which they could fundamentally separate and or being really absorbed by other groups, becoming part of them again, where had all the Europeans here that had mostly dominated the steppes gone? They were still there, right? Just lots of them had been killed, that's true. Many of them had been displaced, but fundamentally, right, even in the nomadic world, still a substantial amount of population taken over by another is remaining there, is roaming around, right? The problem, we don't have tags. Archaeology does not really tell us anything, because if I had to tell you what was the difference even in equipment between a Bulgar and an Avar, it's very complicated to answer, especially when, of course, the closer they could be in time and space. But again, it's mostly a matter of moral discrimination that we cannot, of course, appreciate as much as we would like to appreciate, in fact, material culture, which, again, is all dramatically homogeneous without too many differences. And so we have mostly to rely on the sedentary civilization accounts that are, from an absolute point of view, the single most important thing that exists historically, right? Never be fooled by the new materialism that tells you that, measuring how much the sea level rose in some places in Europe during the early Middle Ages will solve magically all the problems that we have, or will be dramatically useful from a heuristic way to rewrite history, and all this pile of garbage doesn't derive from actually a human failure, an intellectual, personal, cultural, moral failure, right? The incapacity of being able to read an account from people that were essentially trying to answer the same questions that we are trying to find the answer today, and that tell us literally, there we know there was this people that behaved like this, did that, and there is not an evil conspiracy by the terrible, the terrible Christians that hated the pagans and had to destroy their history and all this. But this is again, this is a sociopathic mental disease, right? This is not how a normal human being should think, live, and unfortunately, most people want to believe that because essentially it's much cheaper, which again the average person today finds the most important thing, because of course wealth is a matter of merit, not a matter of how much you can count without doing anything about the thing. It's about your capacity to understand how the world actually works, and it turns out that written accounts are pretty damn reliable. And I say this because there is half of Western historiography that for 70 years or more has alienated itself from reality to pretend that scholarship is more important than the actual sources, right? That need interpretation that the scholar, of course, knows how to answer much better than what that thing is actually trying to tell you from a time, which of course it doesn't even make the effort understanding the traditional spiritual religious and broader kind of, in fact, moral dimension. And that relies on a notionistic, philologistic, at best, approach without much of a moral capacity, right? I cannot stress enough how important this entire thing really is. In all this, what we're observing is that the Turkic tribes, mostly, identifying as such, but with, again, on the top of lots of other people that had been around, that had fundamentally supported them by a substantial degree, as the remnants of the Hunnic Empire, right? And from the Western Eurasian side of the steppes, most of them were called Bulgars, right? Then the concept, again, today there is no time to analyze it. I will make a video about the Bulgars, the old Bulgaria. I made a video about something at least about the first Bulgarian Empire, because eventually when they settled down, they became what we call Bulgarians, and as you know, this is not like even the Hungarians that maintain the Ugro-Finnic language of the rulers. Right? Bulgaria is a Slavic country, not a Turkic one. So these are just I made a video on Hunnic identity explaining these issues in kind of perspective, so in a 21st century perspective regarding how pop culture deals with the concept, the obsession sometimes, the monomaniacal, again, mental disorder of being obsessed about who was who on the basis of nothing sometimes, right? I'm not discussing here specifically Bulgars or whomever, but how easy it is to side in certain ways just because, I don't know, you're complex about coming from a shitty country, right? Which is unfortunately what often happens. You have no idea every time I make, I don't know, a bit about the Alani. There are people writing from, I don't know, certain post-Soviet Russian republics starting to say that they don't even understand what I'm saying in the video. They say that, but they want to copy my video and uploading them on their channel because it's their people, and they think that there is a sort of mafia behind that should, pump about them, and being who knows what. I will tell you those things, some anecdotes, because they're really, they document the cultural misery of a people, right? How completely the grandeur of a people like the Alani can be completely, annihilated by, what probably is not really even the actual continuity of them in those areas. In any case, the betrayal of any Alan creed and moral standards and more. In any case, looking at the Bulgars as the first people we deal with today, we realize that their languages formed a distinctive group within the Turkic family. They had been differentiating. Among the modern Turkic languages, only the Kuvash belongs to this group now. However, behind this genesis, we also know relatively few. We know, though, that in the second half of the 7th century, the Bulgarian tribes of Ciscaucasia, meant from the side of Europe, right, so north of the Caucasus, and essentially the Azov Sea region, formed these three main states, right? One is a bit lesser known, the Sabir Kingdom, on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Then the Great Bulgaria Khanate in the Kuban area and the Azov Sea coasts, and the Khazar Khaganate in the Dagestan steppe, right? So in the late 7th century, the Khazar Khagans belonging to the noblest royal house of Ashina, right, that had been ruling over the ancient Göktürk Khaganate, and that basically had managed to establish itself with a degree of recognized divinity and universal authority on the Turkic people, crushed the Great Bulgaria in the southwest. Right, Great Bulgaria was ruled instead by the Khans of another noble Turkic house, the one of Dula. It was important for these peoples, especially given this Turkic background that had seen had very powerful elites, but somehow depleted, right? Lots of subjects, but still depleted ones. Would try to, we'll see it also in the next episodes, because the steppes was gradually sedentarizing anyway, right? So there wasn't much that people could do on the longer run. Doesn't matter how more nomadic the ancestral homeland of the Turks had been compared to this western areas, but they essentially began to affirm their own individual rule as a dynastic one, something that in the steppes had, especially in the Indo-European ones, had been at least obstacled, and severely so, right? And that was also just a reaction to the objective difficulties that we described prior, that mostly the political fragmentation, the necessity of creating this, boosting further this creed, right, to withstand the possible blows always coming from the steppes here and there, also competing and or being recognized, as we will see now, especially with the Khazars, by the great sedentary empires, Constantinople, right, the Caliphate, etc. These peoples were also quite in contact with the sedentary civilizations, were taking part of their habits, that were reactivating gradually. In this phase, the intercontinental trade, despite having never died out, had brusquely contracted, and also because of the instability, the movements in the steppes. So now these powers were trying to territorialize, to kind of stabilize around certain nuclei. Doesn't matter how still semi-nomadic in nature they remain. Now, when the Khazars crushed Great Bulgaria, some of the latter fled to the Danube to become essentially the European Bulgar Empire, Bulgaria. Some to the Volga, and I made a video about the Volga Bulgars. Warfare, an incredibly original synthesis of many cultures, and also a successful military machine and prosper country that only the Mongols would fundamentally crash and at least resize to the point of relative importance. However, the majority of the great Bulgarians submitted to their kinsmen, the Khazars, right? They would have just been absorbed. One of the reasons why the Khazars took this southwestern direction was mostly and obviously the control of the Black Sea ports, right? Also the one of the northern Pontic steppe, right? The securing also the, as we'll see now, and contending actually from the Caliphate, the Caucasian passes, through which the Khazars, continuing a military tradition, would of whoever was settled basically in the region, would launch raids in the richer sedentary world of Transcaucasia, of the Middle East, right? And naturally, you have to imagine these various bands moving around, at some point being employed by the most diverse powers. There were a handful of Bulgarians that were even settled by the Longobards peacefully in central Italy on the Adriatic, and there are actual Bulgar graves there. And so everything here takes a wider dimension as much as these people could move in, especially after the great Bulgarian diaspora had obliged them to do so in the first place. But their restless military lifestyle was definitely just setting them up for it. Now, in the early 8th century, the Khazar Khaganate went at war with the Caliphate. And this happened largely to most of the Arab neighbors. But by that point, the Caliphate had actually just established itself. It would, as you know, undergo a significant shift in power from Syria to Mesopotamia. So Caucasus acquired an ever greater importance, and in many ways it was the Arabs that really cared about controlling the Caucasus. Like these are the parallel years, aside from of course the Caliphate attack to Constantinople from one side, but also the ones of just we were talking about yesterday in the video about medieval Aquitaine, the ones in which Otto the Great and Charles Martel were fighting themselves against the Arabs coming out of the Pyrenees, right? So the sedentary civilizations were stronger. The Khazars didn't have much of that permanent, direct, say, territorial control for which they could obstacle an army like the Caliphal one, also much closer than, say, Aquitaine from Cordoba, let's say, from their bases. Relatively so, right? This was still a stretched frontier, but still, again, with a greater, say, a caliphal upper hand as far as, especially the stemming of the Khazar incursions from the north was involved. This again is a millenary pattern in the area. We've seen the Scythians invading the Mesopotamian powers in the Bronze Age, the Sarmatians during the Iron One, different directions, arguably depending on the situation. But there was at stake just more than the necessity of sparing the Caliphal heartland from these people's incursions. There was also an important control over, first of all, the peoples inhabiting Transcaucasia, right? That would naturally side in part with the nomads, in part with the caliphs, depending on the situation. Was, by the way, the Byzantine Empire around that was actually, as you know, becoming ally with the Khazars, even for an evident reason here. But there were, again, important branches of the Silk Route to protect in the area. The Caspian Sea was also an important hub of trade, after all. The world here was putting itself in motion. The Vikings were reactivating an important degree of trade, especially in this crescent stretching, in fact, from Ireland to the Caspian Sea and beyond, right? So controlling certain avamposts, not much just in the Caucasian mountains, but even beyond, in the north, along the Caspian coast, and so even in this technically Khazar-dominated hinterland that, however, as we've seen, was also partly sedentarized, especially in this area, right? From a very long time, you've seen it since the first episodes with the Moeotians, etc. Lots of peoples inhabiting at the foothills of the Caucasus and so on were traditionally a bit this middleman of civilization, selling weapons to the nomads to join them into raids to the south, but also trading with whoever was from the other side, and potentially sheltering, in fact, the same areas from the same nomadic attacks. So the Khazar Arab wars were pretty intense. I will make a video about that at a point. And lasted for a considerable amount of time. The Khazars lost also several battles. Again, the sedentary civilizations were, generally speaking, stronger. The Khazars could naturally wear them out, could turn many of these, say, campaigns to inconclusiveness, because the Khazar power bases were far deep into the steppes and could always be moved by a degree. They did rule from from certain fortified centers, from what were evolving as true cities after all, especially thanks to, again, international trade and the strategic position of the Khazars between Europe, Caucasus, the steppes, and so on. But they would also be crushed, right? They would also meet with some of the most advanced militaries at the time, and also being further civilized, right, military-wise, by then, right? We've seen how the steppes peoples developed most of their shock component to cope with the sedentary infantries, right? They were very well armored. They also had a substantial missile capacity to counter the one of the steppes. So they were very interesting military theaters. And the Khazars, in fact, in spite of these defeats on the battlefield, sometimes they did win as well, succeeded in upholding their independence, right? And in the process, by the way, and this is often overlooked, shielding Eastern Europe from Islamic invasions, right? This aspect is somehow, let's say, really overlooked, because if the Khazars historically had not been there, they had not stamped the Arabs, this could have easily poured on the Black Sea coast. They would have always, again, left the steppes out there, but surely they could have put, for example, a greater pressure on Constantinople from the east further, and would have, generally speaking, controlled more easily also other coastal areas. That would have obliged even part of the Byzantine communities, say in Anatolia or in the Balkans, to cooperate with them. So the Khazars were an important bulwark that favored, generally speaking, the Byzantines. It doesn't matter how complex actually the relations really were, but as you know, the Khazars, in order to be a bit more presentable to the sedentary civilizations and their Abrahamic religions, converted, at least their elites, mostly to Judaism. Interestingly enough, some of them actually were Muslims, some of them were Christian. Most of them, the average Khazar, would be pagan fundamentally, but they were not actually alien to what we call improperly monotheism, as much as we improperly call paganism. Actually, the idea that these were the great empires and that God's favor was mostly from their side, because God was only one for everybody involved, including the pagans, contrarily to what you've been brought to falsely and criminally believe, as far as history of religions is concerned, really attracted these people to the point of wanting to be part of the bigger empire. That is what they had always wanted to be, right? As long as these elites were strong and they were just living in a condition for which they couldn't be immediately sanitarized, if not becoming somebody else's subjects, which they naturally didn't want, they still wanted to cooperate, right? To the point there was also an imperial marriage with a Khazar princess that naturally had been converted promptly to Christianity from Judaism in the process, and that would in fact make these Khazars particularly suitable for Constantinople's strategy, especially against the Caliphate, right? On the other hand, the Khazars had to leave Ciscaucasia in the process, because this had been the theater of the major clashes with the Abbasids, and many of their clans had to migrate to the lower Bulgar region instead, so far northeast away, where their capital had been founded, and also in the Don region, where Khazar fortresses were erected to guard this natural barrier. Now, these Khazar fortresses were surrounded by the sites of Slavonic farmers, as well as Alanian artisans. Right? You know that, as I was saying at the beginning during my rant, the Ossetians are credited with being kind of at least the most direct descendants of the Alani, about whom I made a quite successful video almost 2 years ago, living in the foothills of the Caucasus, but that had remained scattered in many areas, such as other peoples, the Goths, for example, living in Crimea and in other areas. So all what I was referring to before as the relics of peoples have been crushed by the various waves of nomads, but that had fundamentally settled down and remained as simple subjects that were just paying their own tribute, living their own life, and yes, being involved every once in a while with this kind of messy situations, mostly having to cope with some raiding warfare here and there, but still helping generally. The same goes for the Alani had remained actually substantially warlike people. At least some of them were used, and they would kept being used up to later times, even the Mongol ones, as imperial bodyguards of all the greatest powers in the world. Right, there were still Alanian bodyguards in Constantinople. There would be again in this other great empire, as far as China. At some point, this had been their deal historically, and they were also craftsmen, and they had an interesting metallurgic tradition and so on. The Slavs, as we've seen in the previous videos, and I have a pretty hefty Slavic history playlist by this point, had instead been expanding in a more gradual yet very pervasive way, because there were many. At least they expanded substantially, covering an immense area that in the east bordered naturally from the sanitary world of the forest, mostly the one of the steppes. But in this region here is the one in which Slavs and Khazars basically meet one another. They start essentially coexisting, aside from some scalp or decapitation here and there, because otherwise one cannot really have fun. And generally speaking, say depending on one another politically, right? Originally, of course, the Khazars were, as Turkic leaders, a bit the stronger, the shepherds of people. The Slavs had been moved during displaced in part in the migration era at the in the retinue at the following at least of this great, say, Avar warriors, for example. However, they had also been gradually compacting politically, and especially this the Khazar frontier would be the probably the seminal area of the development of the Kievan Rus. I made a video about that some months ago, in the genesis of the Kievan Rus specifically. We will have to continue that a little series that in fact shows Slavic settlements, right? These were sanitary people. So what the Khazars would do would just knock at the door, like the mafia, like asking for a tribute, protection, hash money, however you want to call it. And in part, naturally, being welcome in that function by the Slavs, because there were other ferocious neighbors that the Khazars could defend the Slavs from, or together with them, frankly, in just as even this very powerful mounted, element that they incarnated with their elites, right? So the Slavs were gradually developing that consistent mounted contingents from a military tradition that had been mostly about infantry. So again, the surplus gathered on this great Russian rivers, as we've seen, the demographic push that, especially from the forested areas, could not really be challenged by the steppes peoples, because those could launch raids even in there, but it was risky, and lots of steppes peoples were actually cut down in those trees. and that they couldn't anyway control permanently, right? So even there was all a tribute system, etc. But the Slavs were coalescing and managing to, to create forces capable of, as it would happen finally, crush the same Khazars when the Kievan Rus was consolidated, right? Which is remarkable. We'll have to talk necessarily about that military historical chapter. In any case, the Khazars helped that process, right? You often find this mechanism. We have definitely always underestimated the cemeteries. We have always underestimated civilization, right? It's instinctive, because instinctively people like the barbarian, like Ares. They don't like Athena, right? But the idea is that, oh wow, the great horsemen on the steppe. But at the end of the day, look at what literally they are now. And so that is to say, cancelled from the face of the earth, or sedentarized in the first place. So the thing also, starting from medieval times, also before, should make you really reflect. In any case, this sort of Khazar feudalism, the construction of castles, also the substantial amount of estates owned, at least by the elite, for affording their heavy panoply and so on, it's all things that gradually the Rus would absorb and use at their own advantage. All right. The Iranian-speaking Alanians spread further in this system, occupying some areas in Crimea and the Don region, just colonizing them. The Khazar rulers thus had been opening really a very large trade system, reigning over the lands from the middle, the Dnieper, where Kiev is at the center of the Polian Slavs, and with the residence of a Khazar governor, the Tudun, right, the Shambat-Makermen fortress was a place, up to the middle Volga, right? So controlling this main trade centers, right, and just with these forces that could be again augmented also with the one of other centuries, yes, but also other nomads that could be paid just with the surplus that would derive from controlling these places. So naturally some tensions would arise between the two groups at some point, until the ultimate break, as we were recalling before. Now, the principal strength of the Khazar army, to speak concretely about their forces, and we will make videos about in detail the organization, the tactics, the unit types, and so on, but just to picture better the center of the power, the deterrent force, how the Khazars would keep this thing together. Well, this would happen through the several thousand strong guard of the Khagan, right, which served for pay, telling you how rich actually for the times and places really they were, because these were actually a tactically complete army. They had lighter troops, but the core was very heavy as well, right? The pulp instead of the broader Khazar army would be made up of the forces of the same ethnic Khazars, but also the Bulgarians, that, as we've seen, Bulgars had been just subsumed in a way or another, and even Alanian chiefs that kept participating, as we were saying before, from the top of their radically brutal topping of the Indo-European military standards, and that would never basically back down, and that actually would be used as some sort of, not really second-hand forces, but still, of course, as the one of a minority. Now, the Khazar army consisted of heavy and light cavalry men in the perfect habit of the steppes, perhaps with a bit more of material load, as we will see now, showing a bit the fact part of them had been sedentarizing already at this point, and again, the important wealth that derived from such position, right, in the steppe. The Khazar war gear maintained essentially the traditions of the Turkic Khaganates, as we had described them in the previous episodes. However, it was also subject to influences from the Caucasus that had a hell of a military culture on its own, especially a feudal one, right, of mountaineers, also heavy cavalry for that matter that was going on for millennia. We've seen it since the Urartians, by the way. The Byzantine Empire that surely was making school, and that would be gradually, remounting over time, even though this was the moment of greatest contraction. But also the spring of Central Asia, from which the most robust and sturdy mounted element could be really drawn still in substantial numbers at various waves of these peoples, whatever their cyclical diaspora really was in the outer world, let's put it in this way. In the full wake of the Turkic military tradition, a powerful composite bow and arrows were the most important weapons. Right, massive bows, practically long bows, and designed to essentially wear out the enemy at a distance. Not much. Again, this had been a Turkic prerogative, right? Less shock element compared to the earlier sagas, etc. However, other weapons had been at least increasing in importance. For example, the saber assumed an ever-growing relevance in Khazar warfare. Part of this has to do with still the lower elements, right? The ones that had relatively impoverished. The fact that also the peoples that basically bordered the Khazar Khaganate were not, we're talking about the 7th, the 8th century, so we're still very, very poor times overall. So again, the scarcity of armor from both sides would bring weapons to be more leaning towards kind of a cutting function, especially from horseback during raids and quick hits. As we've seen, the primary weapon remained the bow in a sense, even though, of course, the missile component was not the decisive one. The heavy cavalry was. The broadsword that we've seen spreading a bit in the Turkic world for the same reasons as a bow. That is to say more chopping, fundamentally, than it had been the case before, at least even among some of the heavier warriors, because likely of the greater scarcity of armor compared to ancient times, at least at this point. Then things would change gradually back again. The saber acquires historically at this point its classical shape. Right, saber is to be attributed to this again phenomenon of the Turkic wave. Right, the fact that likely was much easier and cheaper, by the way, to equip all these forms of subject with a curved sword that actually does require less training than a straight one that had been still, also distinctive a bit of the elite, especially of the early Turk Khaganates, right? But now this thing is generalizing, in part also, as far as the elites were concerned, also, strengthening. And some of these sabers were massive things that could really, hit hard, also against armor and other not so soft targets, telling you the truth. Then to a cavalry spear, battle axes preferred by the Alanians particularly, and flails with weights that were cherished instead by the Khazars, interestingly enough, were added. Right, the Alanians had remained a bit more kind of, infantry biased at this point. They had been at least put on foot more often, surely, that their glory days in Sarmatian times. The flail with weights is a quite picturesque weapon that suggests at least that, again, there could be this sort of ever more kind of still Turkic distance from the enemy, but still inflicting substantial blunt trauma with these balls that could be quite insidious, like being slashed that way from horseback. Long battle knives were very popular as well, and they were a bit the bridge between the humble, multitask knife and the saber itself, right? A sort of reminiscence of some similarity with the sax that was still a thing in Western Europe from, in fact, likely again a more steppish origin, let's put it in this way. More rarely, pairs of knives that seem likely to have been missile weapons are also witnessed, which again shows you how still the improvement in this kind of warfare was based on a missile dimension. Defensive gear, as we noticed before, is starting getting slightly heavier. There seems to have been some kind of standardization kicking in. At least it's a big word for the times and places. What I mean really is that the Khazars were in control of this, again, mostly fortified centers, developing to some also large trade hubs. They could really accumulate and mass a substantial amount of wealth of material. They had, as we've seen, just lots of specialized craftsmen among their subjects that were living fairly close to pretty advanced places, could buy it from there, and we find a typical kind of gear consisting in spherical helmets with mail tippets, mail and lamellar armor that appear a bit also more spread than what had been the average kind of Turkic outlook, right? That was more tribal, more just came straight out of the bowels of the earth in the far, eastern steppes, from conditions of incredibly traumatic, material primitiveness, right, in many ways, and that, in fact, have mostly owed their further development from the Iranians. Here, however, it's something different, right? Here we see a real, power that is also more stable and successful than others, even further east, even from the most prestigious Turkic Khaganates of Central Asia, that probably invests in a more concentrated and uniform way in the equipment of the aforementioned bulk of forces at the service of the Khagan, and that therefore maintains some military standards, also on the basis of essentially investing in the equipment, in the armament of this corps, and then for the rest relying on very wild primitive elements all around, right? But having to cope again with a lot of well armored enemies as well, having their core forces well equipped, standardized. We've seen in the case of the Byzantines, the Caliphate doesn't kid either. So at this point, the Khazars are even implementing on the Turkic, the previous Turkic gear by adding, for example, pieces of equipment redolent of Central Asia, right, the homeland of their rulers, typically brassards, greaves, and bards, right, and making them more spread than before. Even among these troops that are not just subjects at this point, in part they are soldiers. They are maintained by the Kaghan in more permanent facilities, infrastructures. They have stocks, magazines, and so on, where they can, scattered across this territory with, rudimentary but still efficient military administration, right, for counting on quite up-to-date forces at the time, coping with the variety of enemies that we're just indicating. And Khazar armor was definitely fairly original in itself, because its plates were clamped by iron rivets, but not too tightly. This made armor substantially flexible, right? It was actually a more laborious way of manufacturing it, but it rendered it more resistible in many ways. Round wooden shields remained from the traditional Turkic panoply, but were reinforced by a high round iron umbo at the center, so making them somehow more apt for hand-to-hand fighting, right? Punching somebody in the face with that, and deflecting never more powerful blows, right? They had to cope with substantially heavy cavalry around, right? The caliphs fielded some of the heaviest Persian subject cavalries, for example. The Byzantines were yet to develop their full cataphracts. That would occur mostly during the 10th century, late 9th, but they still had pretty heavy forces themselves. So the necessity of making these shields also slightly more concave, for example, suggests that there was some sort of need for individual fighting from the kind of heavier troops that could be sheltered within the shield and acting a bit in solo, given the increase in kind of nightly investment. Let's put it in this way. It's almost imperceptible compared to like what we can think was the average just a bit before, a bit later, but the tendency is there, and it does speak of a tendentially more feudal, but also more orderly and more concentrated Kaghanal force. Right. In the second half of the 9th century, yet another wave of peoples, this time Ugriphinic, the Magyars, the Hungarian nomads, poured west from the South Urals. Right. About their ethnogenesis, we also do not know that much, but these people came as nomads, as they had become so while actually being sedentaries, or at least very sedentary by semi-nomads, right? Warriors of the forests that eventually were injected or sucked into the game of the steppes, especially towards the southwest where the Avar Kaghanate lay, and they were compact enough to basically move as one, a substantial ethnic cohesion. And of course, these Ugriphinic warriors had been, going around from a while, evidently. And at least, say, it was rare, but it could still happen, with friendly behavior towards at least the Khazars. Probably because the latter were very powerful and they were not so interested in the far northwest of these domains, were kind of poorer, more primitive. I mean, most of the interest, as we've seen, was towards definitely the southwest. And however, they influenced the Magyars remarkably, right? Many elements of their culture, including the military ones as well. What appears, however, from the Magyars is that they acquired two remarkable influences next to the Khazar ones that are essentially developed in a unique and quite impressive way. One is definitely a strong Central Asian influence, right? Something that looked even more vicious, smarter, faster, kind of even more predatory, more Asiatic proper. And on the other side, through their path across the steppes corridors towards the west, an important polyurcetic capacity. This we have observed already among the Avars, but the Magyars are really impressive, and even when they settle down for good in fact, Hungarian plains at the westernmost end of the steppes in Europe, they kept maintaining very strong relations with the Khazar world, but the areas of the Caspian Sea, the Middle East, Persia, and we see in fact an incredible amount of properly of arms and armor being keeping to be imported through the Danube, the Black Sea, that was basically the westernmost branch of the Silk Route, connecting them with this kind of Middle Eastern world for centuries to come. Even I made a video about Hungarian warfare, and until the 13th, the 14th century, you still find this since the 9th. So these characteristics would make the Magyars that naturally had heavy cavalry akin to that of the Khazars, the Bulgarians, the Alanians, that were all participating, by the way, to their migration in some war bands. Some of the most successful peoples around, as you know, and one that would also more resiliently stick to the Hungarian steppes. In fact, it would take the name after them, differently from the Huns and the Avars that, yes, had in part remained there, but that had lost practically an ethnic face, had been simply absorbed by the local population, so much so that the modern country of Hungary still speaks that Ugro-Finnic language. So the Magyars, however, were not such a huge people to simply go smoothly through the steppes and crushing others, and especially the hegemonic one of the Khazars in the west. They had some, they went by steps, right? They settled, first of all, in the lower Dnieper region. They terrorized the Danubian Bulgaria, by the way, and Constantinople, that admittedly had been using them for the same purpose against the Bulgarians, that, as you know, were by this point a looming threat on the empire, sort of, the ugly twin from a Byzantine perspective that wanted just to be create a sort of shared empire and bullying you into this kind of consortium to be recognized as emperors themselves and whatever. And they were successful in these raids until they were actually routed in turn by the Pechenegs. This that we will talk about in the next episode. This would trigger their further movement. Right, they went up to the Dnieper River. They passed Kiev, and through the Carpathians, they reached their new homeland in the late 9th century. There are different episodes narrated about the interaction with these various peoples, the agreements, the movements. Again, they moved with everything, with the cattle, with all the carriages, the entire population, and they finally settled in the Hungarian plain, right? During this movement, the Magyars, as we've seen also the other day with the video about Great Moravia, came into contact with the Slavs, both in the Dnieper region and in Central Europe, Slavic warcraft was enriched by this contact, as it had been already from the one with the Avars, with the Huns, and so on. However, especially in Central Europe, most of these Slavs that had been enjoying this kind of, free existence, at least because of the collapse of the Avar Khaganate and the fact that finally the Western, the Southern Slavs didn't have any other power to divide them as such anymore, would be mostly subjected, especially the Moravians and others, to the newly established Magyar principality that, as you know, began to harass savagely for generations, the 3/4 of a century, all the post-Carolingian kingdoms, before being finally crushed by the Ottonian forces, and essentially being obliged to settle down, to Christianize, to become a kingdom proper, and to therefore starting that, at least completing that process of sedentarization that the Magyars also underwent by having settled in the Hungarian plain, right? As you know, I do have again, these videos are just minimal introductions to these guys' warfare, but I already made several videos about Hungary, the Magyars, and so on, so you can all find in the adequate, in the pertinent playlists, and I will keep hopefully adding on this content, naturally, which is quite important. But again, picturing, even if minimally so, sometimes we have really, the heaviness, for example, of Khazar cavalry, right? The compactness of it, the massive size of the sabers, for example, or also cavalry armor. Just we described it in the previous videos for the broader Turkic world, but facing a Khazar heavy cavalryman in open field was not exactly a pleasant or enjoyable experience, right? And the prowess, the physicality, the kind of still the fascinating hybrid between the sedentary world and this, at least this flavor of civilization is quite fascinating in Khazaria. That will be crushed later. It's one of the great empires that practically left no trace of itself, but that once upon a time dominated the Western Eurasian steppes, to the point of also really changing the history of many of the surrounding countries, developing and challenging, stimulating their military cultures, and again, the history of a people that thought to make it right their own way. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.